got a few requests for a build video on my homemade tractor, and since I'm stuck home on quarantine, I have time to do it. When I started the project, at first I wasn't taking any video, but I took a lot of pictures, and I put some of those still shots together into a video to show the build process. So here's the finished tractor, or I'm sure there'll be some fixes and improvements along the way, but right now it's pretty much done. And I just have a carry-all I threw together real quick on the back with some of my tree climbing equipment. My dad's homemade tractor was my inspiration to build my own tractor. This tractor does a lot of heavy duty work that's too much for a lawnmower sized tractor. And through my build process, whenever I was stumped on how to do something, I'd call my dad up and say, "How was it done on the little yellow tractor?" This tractor was built in the late 1950s by my grandfather. The tractor has done a lot of work through the years, and it held up really well. It was also used for recreation, as you could see in the pictures. This is a beat-up old 702 wheel horse I found on Craigslist. I used a few parts from this tractor: the footrest as pedals, the seat pan, the steering wheel. But the major component that I used from this wheel horse tractor was the transmission. The rear end for the tractor is a Ford 8.8-inch limited slip differential that I removed from a mid-90s era Ford F-150 in the junkyard. The engine is a cast iron Briggs 16 horsepower. The engine had spark and good compression. This was another Craigslist find. The tractor uses two transmissions to gear it down and give gear options. This Ford Model A car transmission I found on Craigslist. The front axle, spindles, and steering components come from a '56 Chevy half-ton pickup. This was my grandfather's pickup, junked in the woods, and I spent a lot of time playing in it when I was a kid and was happy to have it as part of my homemade tractor. I assembled the tractor from back to front, starting with the rear end. The first step was to narrow the rear end. Here you can see the rear end with the tubes cut off. I used a piece of cold rolled steel and some custom made bushings as a jig. The jig, along with some clamps, held the tubes in place to be re-welded. I asked my dad to do these welds for me. These welds needed to be really strong and needed to be able to hold the oil in the rear end. And since my dad's a much better welder, I asked him to do it. Here is the rear end after it was all welded back together. Next, I welded the original brackets back on a different position to mount the rear end to the frame. I couldn't find anyone locally to respline the shortened axles, so I sent them to Idaho to Dutchman Axle to have them resplined. I reassembled the rear end with a new clutch pack and new bearings. For the wheel horse transmission, I got all new bearings and seals. When I reassembled it, I didn't include the differential or axles. I also cut the axle tubes off the transmission case. For the Model A transmission, I got new bearings and seals. These gears showed some wear and had some pitting, but a new set cost $900, so I decided to reuse the old ones. The Briggs and Stratton engine was in good shape but not running. The carb needed to be rebuilt. I cleaned up some carbon with the head off and replaced the head gasket. Once it was reassembled, it started right up. frame members of the tractor are 3 by 3 by 3/8 angle iron. I cut and bent and welded them to fit under the tubes of the rear end. To connect the drivetrain from the Ford 8.8-inch rear end to the Model A transmission, I had to come up with a customized U-joint. I cut the end off the drive shaft from a Ford F-150 and disassembled a Model A U-joint that I got on eBay. I don't have machining tools, so I had to do the cuts by hand and just eyeball it to keep everything true. I used the grill to heat things up and then to let them cool slowly after the welds to minimize warpage. Next, I mounted the Model A transmission to the frame. I'm really happy with the way this U-joint turned out. Even though I had to eyeball everything, it came out nearly perfect. I hope it holds up. A heavy-duty roller chain connects the wheel horse transmission to the Model A transmission. To mount a sprocket on the Model A transmission, I used part of the clutch plate from the Model A and drilled some holes and mounted it to a sprocket that I got from Granger. Bolted together, now power can be transferred from the roller chain into the splines of the Model A transmission. I used a pillow block bearing in place of the pilot bearing for the transmission to keep everything running true. I welded together some pieces to mount the wheel horse transmission to the frame and allow it to move up and down in order to adjust the tightness of the chain. Here it is mounted in place with the chain. For the purposes of ground clearance, I had to flip the front axles upside down from the way they were mounted on the truck. Because of the angle of the kingpins, I needed to cut the ends of the axles off and re-weld them back on at a different angle. I cut the axle to width and welded it back together in the middle. It's mounted on a 1-inch shaft that goes into pillow block bearings and serves as the pivot point for the front axle. I bought rims for a trailer to serve as the front wheels of the tractor. In order to get them to fit on the hubs of the Chevy pickup without a lathe, I mounted the hubs in the vise, made a simple holder for the angle grinder, and ground them down to the right diameter. Then I drilled holes to fit the lug pattern of the rims. I tacked the lug bolts in place so I don't have to hold them with the wrench when I'm taking the wheels on and off. The front wheels have a positive camber to make it easier to turn with the manual steering box. I had to make some custom cuts and welds to mount the tie rod. I ran the tie rod out in front of the axle the way you see on a lot of old-fashioned tractors to maintain the range of motion of the axle pivot. I also mounted the tie rod as high as possible to maintain ground clearance. Tie rod was set up to utilize an Ackerman angle with steering. The tractor uses a belt slip clutch system. This is the clutch pedal and linkage. A heavy-duty spring keeps back tension against the belts with this ATV wheel bearing as an idler pulley. When the clutch is pressed down, the tension is released. Here's the clutch pedal mounted in place. This piece of sheet metal serves to keep the belt from going round when the clutch is depressed, so the belt doesn't grab. The idler bearing runs in between the Briggs engine and the wheel horse transmission. It's a tight space. It's hard to get a good view of how this setup works. The steering box is from a late 60s era Mustang or Mercury. I took it apart and repacked it with fresh grease. Once reassembled, everything worked tight and smooth. The steering box is mounted in place beneath the wheel horse transmission. I had to lengthen the steering shaft. Luckily, it turned out to be the same diameter shaft as the tie rod, and I had some left over from when I narrowed that. So I welded the two together. Because of the splines on the steering box and the angle at which it's mounted, I had to make a custom pitman arm. Things got really complicated at this part of the project because of how tight everything needed to fit. I had to use a relay lever to connect the drag link to the steering, and for this, I used the hub from my '99 Honda Civic that was left over from a recent repair. This piece holds the steering column support as well as providing a mount place for the gas tank. I bent a piece of heavy sheet metal to match the shape of the wheel horse hood and then welded them together with some supports underneath and some Bondo to smooth out the rough welds. Because I didn't want to have to maintain a battery, I made the tractor a rope start, and for this reason I made the lower portion of the front grille removable. Here's the bracket that holds it in place. This grille is also part of the wheel horse tractor. I made a custom mount with the spring from a bicycle to mount the seat from the wheel horse. The brake pedal mounts under the frame and pulls on the emergency brake cables from the F-150. I have a separate video on this. This is looking down at the brake pedal after it is mounted in position. I bought a Category 1 3-point hitch kit for a Kubota to set up a 3-point hitch on the tractor. Works either with the hydraulic jack or a hand lever. I have a separate video on that too. This is a frame that I set up to mount the top link and the lift arms for the 3-point hitch. Here's the lift arm and top link mount in place. I added some footrests. I added an arm with teeth cut in it to hold down the brake pedal for a parking brake. For the final finishing touch, I needed a knob for the shifting lever. I turned down a piece of hickory on a drill press and then epoxied it on top of the Model A transmission shifting lever. The whole project took just under 2 years, working after work and weekends. There were a few times where I felt really stuck and would take off a few days or even a few weeks till I got the ambition to get started again. I had to skip a lot of the little things to keep the video to a reasonable length. Hopefully I included all the big picture stuff though.